Now we're up to Daf Yutes Amid Beis. And the name of the Al HaMemra is on the bottom of Yutes Amid Aleph, Levi Bar Shmuel, and he's reading the Megillah in the presence of Rabbi Yehuda, Kakari Kamed Rabbi Yehuda b'Megillah, Aksuva ben Aksuva. That's a no-no. So Omar Lei, Rabbi Yehuda responds to Mari Omru Chazal tell us that Akari Megillah ben Aksuv, Aksuva ben Aksuvim lo yotza. And therefore, Levi Bar Shmuel was not Yotze the mitzvah Megillah. Omar Rab Chia Bar Abba, Rab Yochanan Akari b'Megillah, Aksuva ben Aksuvim lo yotza. Umachi lei amocha. He hit himself on the head. In other words, what he said was, I forgot to tell you the punchline. I left out the main point. And you walk away with the misimpression that you cannot be Yotze reading the Megillah if it's Ksuva ben Aksuvim. That's not so. Hani mili only b'tzibur shanu. When we're reading the Megillah publicly, in order to add an extra dimension of Pirsum Anes, of Kiyum, Kriyas HaMegillah b'tzibur, then it's got to be nikar to everyone that you're reading a separate, independent Megillah that's written as a sefer unto itself, but it's not wrapped up, together with other Sfarim. But if he's reading it for himself, privately, then he can read it Ksuva ben Aksuvim. He knows that he's reading it as a Megillah when he's reading it publicly. And we see from this Gemara an amazing thing, that there's a separate kiyum of Kriyas HaMegillah b'tzibur. It's an entity on itself. We thought it's just Barov Amad just Melech, and you get an extra brownie points for it. But no, he's saying it's a kiyum, a mitzvah unto itself with its own binim. Could be a tremendous nafkamina in terms of ksuva ben aksuva, which would not be meaningful to obtain that special, unique kiyum of Kriyas HaMegillah b'tzibur. Amar Rab Chia bar Abba, Amar Rab Yochanan, Akorei b'Megillah aksuva ben aksuvim lo yatza. But shiur hatfar halach l'Moshe miSinai. Shiur means he has to leave something blank, so to speak, a margin, what we call. And we're talking about now a requirement of leaving a margin on the top of each gilyon, of each part of the cloth. And underneath that margin, you have stitches, and below those stitches, you have to leave that margin. And all this is machvile amocha lo omru el kadesh lo yikara. If the entire length of the parchment was sewn, the seam would tear whenever somebody rolled the scroll too tightly. But when you leave space on the top and on the bottom, one would notice if you were rolling the scroll too tightly, for the sections of parchment would begin to separate. He would then refrain from tightening it. Now it says here, Lo omru el kadesh lo yikara. I think what the Gemara is saying here by adding that is that he would be Yotze the mitzvah of Mikra Megillah, b'di'evet, if he wasn't Mishayah. Only l'chatchila kadesh lo yikara, but that can't be, because he says halach l'Moshe miSinai. So I have to retract that statement. V'amar Rab Chia bar Abba amar Rab Yochanan ilmolei nishtayer b'ma'ora sha'amad b'mochav Eliyahu kimlo nekev machat sidkis lo yicholim lamod b'bnei ora shenemar ki lo yir'ani adam v'chai. So in the Parsha Kitisa in Shmos, Hashem assures Moshe Rabbeinu, it shall come to pass that while my glory passes over you, I shall shelter you in the cleft of the rock, V'nikvas Hatzur. So that protected Moshe Rabbeinu from possibly being hurt by the Shekhinah. Eliyahu stood in the same cave when the divine presence passed before him, as indicated in Malachim Beis, Perek Yutes. Eliyahu came into the cave. God said, go and stand on the mountain. And behold, Hashem was passing over the mountain. So we're talking about somehow the light of the divine presence is so intense when it passes outside that if it would have entered into the cave, then Moshe and Aaron would not be able to withstand that brilliant light. Shenemar ki lo yir'ani ha'adam v'chai. Rab Chia bar Abba, Rab Yochanan, my siv, what does it mean in the pasuk? V'aleim kechol hadvarim asher dibra Hashem imochem bahar. So we're talking about the second set of luchos. The writing upon the tablets was in accordance with all the words that Hashem spoke to you on the mountain. Melame sher'o HaKadosh Baruch Hu l'Moshe dikdukei Torah. The dikdukei sofrim. Umasha sofrim asidim lechadesh. Umayniu mikra Megilla. So again, let's go over Mitzvah Shem, the last piece of Gemara before the Mishnah. The Amar Rab Chia bar Abba Rab Yochanan, my dichsiv. And we're learning now a pasuk in Dvarim. V'alehem kechol advarim asher diber Hashem imochem bahar. So it means on the second set of luchos, the same that was written on the first set of luchos appeared on the second set. Malame sheheral HaKadosh Baruch Hu l'Moshe dikdukei Torah v'dikdukei sofrim masha sofrim asidim l'chadesh. Okay. So it says here, alehem kechol. What's the word kechol? It could have said alehem hadvarim. Why kechol? And from the extra kechol, we're deriving a number of conclusions. Number one, dikdukei Torah. What's dikdukei Torah? Dikdukei Torah means, like, let's say there's an extra word in a pasuk, and we derive conclusions from the extra word. That's called dikdukei Torah. Then we have something called dikdukei sofrim, which I believe is referring to an asmachta. In other words, we find something, you have a halach in Torah Sheba'al Peh, you want to find some basis for it, some inference from the language of Torah Shebachsav. And finally, we have the Rabbanans. Shasofrim asidim l'chadish. Now again, the Rambam has a very unique shita here that what's called sofrim is not exactly the Rabbanan. For example, the Rambam says Kedushay Kesef is divrei sofrim, even though we derive from Gzeira Shava of Kicha Mistei Ephron, but it doesn't have the identical status as a Doraisa. It's somewhere, I don't know, in the never in the ambiguous twilight zone between Doraisa and the Rabbanan. But it's definitely up there. We're not going to say that a man who marries a woman with Kedushay Kesef on a Doraisa level, he's not married to her. That's impossible. Akol Ksherim, the new Mishnah. Akol Ksherim Likros says a Megilla. Chutz mi Cheresh Shot V'Katan Rabbi Yehuda Machshir B'Katan. An amazing sheet of Rabbi Yehuda that could only apply to a Rabbanan like Mikra Megillah, but on a Doraisa level, a Katan could not be Motzi a Gadol. And now we have Cheresh and Shota. A Cheresh is a person who cannot hear and he cannot speak, what we call a deaf mute. If he's deaf and not mute, then he's not called a cheresh. But the exception to that rule might be Mikra Megillah, because the mitzvah of Mikra Megillah is not just to enunciate the words and generate the sounds, but to be able to hear the sounds. And if he's deaf, he cannot hear the sounds. What'd you say? No. So that's called a cheresh. Then we have something called a shota. Now, a shota is a sugya in Masechet Hagiga. Basically, there are 4 simone shota, and he exhibits some very strange behavior patterns and has the status of a shota. We tend to identify a shota as someone who is retarded, but I'm not sure that that's really a precise definition on a halachic legal level. Because, for example, one of the simone shota is uyoshen b'beis hakvaros. I mean, are you going to tell me that anyone who sleeps in a cemetery, as strange as it sounds, he's retarded? I don't know. And then today we know that there are geniuses who have IQs of superior IQs, and yet socially they cannot relate to people. So I don't think retardation would be an accurate translation of the word shota. Now Rabbi Yehuda says that a katan is kosher for Megillah, for reading in the Megillah. Again, let's say he's Igia L'chinuch, he's mature enough and he's trained enough to read the Megillah. But Rabbi Yehuda is telling us that since the reading of the Megillah is D'Rabbanan, and the Katan is Chayav in Chinuch, he's Igia L'chinuch, he's Chayav in Rabbanan, therefore, Asi Chad D'Rabbanan ve'mafik Chad D'Rabbanan. The Tanakama, on the other hand, the Chachamim, they're of the opinion that we have what's called trade Rabbanos. Number one, for every adult, Megillah is Rabbanon. Now he is a Katan, so he has a double Rabbanon, and therefore he's not on the same level of Chiyuv. There's no din of Arevu, of Arvus, and therefore he's not Motzi a Gadol. The Gemara says, Man Tana Cheresh di Eved Nami Lo. The Gemara understands that when it says in the Mishnah Chutz mi Cheresh, it means that even the Eved, if a Cheresh read the Megillah on behalf of a kosher, of a normal person who hears, you would not be Yotze. Omar Rav Masna, Rabbi Yossi, our Mishnah reflects the Shita Rabbi Yossi in Brachas Taftes Vav, HaKorei es hashma v'lo shmiya li ozno yatsa. Again, the Gemara now, in the name of Rav Masna, is not sensitive to the distinction between someone who has the capacity to hear, but he didn't read it loud enough so he couldn't hear, as opposed to a cheresh who doesn't even have the capacity to hear. So the Gemara says, "We might Rabbi Yossi, you're assuming that our Mishnah reflects the sheet of Rabbi Yossi. That Koresh Mavalosh Milozno Lo Yatsa. Maybe not. Dilma Rabbi Yehudi, Udchatchila Hudelo Hadievet Chaper Domi. We don't have to go so far as assuming that according to our Mishnah, even B'di'evet you're not Yotze. Mechatesi, maybe it means Chatchila, we should avoid it. But B'di'evet you're certainly Yotze. And hence, I don't have to invoke the Shita Rabbi Yossi and assume that he's not Yotze even B'di'evet. So Gemara says, "O Salka Daita, Tani Cheresh Dumya Deshota V'Katan." The Mishnah in one breath mentions Cheresh together with Shota and Katan. Shota and Katan for sure is B'di'evet is not Yotze. Is Ma Shota V'Katan B'di'evet Nami Lo, Av Cheresh B'di'evet Nami Lo. So the Gemara says that's not necessarily so. And it's all about the literary style of the Mishnah. Dilma Hakadisa, Hakadisa. When the Mishnah lumps together Cheresh together with Shota and Katan, it's Hakadisa, Hakadisa, two separate categories with two separate sets of dinim. And although in the case of a Shota and Katan, he's not Yotze, but in the case of a Cheresh, then B'di'evet, he would be Yotze. Now it's interesting. If a Cheresh could read the Megillah on behalf of a normal person who has hearing, then I have two questions. Number one, does that mean that the deaf person himself is chayav in the Mikra Megillah? I'm tempted to think that the answer is yes, but I don't see anything here in the notes. I'm sure somebody's going to point this out. And my second question is, why l'chatchila are we inhibited? I mean, if a deaf person could read the Megillah, he probably reads the Megillah better than anyone else in the thing. Why can't he l'chatchila read the Megillah on our behalf? Now the Gemara says the following. Midak Tani Sefer Rabbi Yehuda Machshav B'Kod Michlal D'Reish Alav Rabbi Yehuda. Whenever Mishnah quotes a Man D'Yomer at the end, it means that the first Man D'Yomer disagrees with him. So Gemara says, Dilma Kula Rabbi Yehuda. Maybe the Mishnah reflects from the beginning to the end the Shita Rabbi Yehuda. So the Gemara says, no. Mi dami reishal psula v'seifal ikshera. You can't possibly say that the Mishnah is Kula Rabbi Yehuda, because the Reish of the Mishnah says, Hakol kosher l'bikriyas hamegillah chutz micherik shota v'katan. Obviously, katan is being excluded. So you can't say Dilma Kula Rabbi Yehuda when Rabbi Yehuda maintains that a katan could be motzi or gadol. The Gemara says, "V'Dilma Kula Rabbi Yehuda u'trei gavni katan tanile." Maybe the Mishnah is referring to two different categories of a katan. And it all depends upon whether he's above the age of 9 or lower than the age of 9. And this is the way we have to read the Mishnah. Is afil lechatchila. We're going to allow him to read even lechatchila sherab Yehuda machshir b'katan. So really, the whole Mishnah from beginning to end is Rabbi Yehuda. How could the Mishnah exclude Chere Shota V'Katan? The answer is that we're talking about someone who is lo higia l'chinuch. So here we have to point out something that we left out before. When we go back to Rabbi Yossi for a minute, Rabbi Yossi's opinion is recorded in the Mishnah in Brachos as Lo Ishmiel Liozno Lo Yotza. However, what we failed to mention is that his bar plugta is none other than Rabbi Yehuda. And Rabbi Yehuda holds in Kriyat Shema that, just 1 second, Kriyat Shema. He is Yotze. According to Rabbi Yossi, you must hear Shema. Right? Shema Yisrael, Hashmei Lioznecha Mashapicha Medaber. And that's impossible in the case of a deaf person. So Rabbi Yossi therefore would maintain that for sure a deaf person is excluded from Kriyat Shema. But now we have the Shita of Rabbi Yehuda, and he disagrees with regard to Kriyat Shema. He holds that even a deaf person could be Yotzei Kriyat Shema. So again, keep in mind, there's a principle here that underlies this whole sugya. And that is that when you're creating the Megillah B'tzibur on behalf of others, then we jack up the requirements l'chatchila. Again, we haven't really clarified why that's so, but that's axiomatic here in the sugya. Therefore, it's possible that this entire Mishnah of ours is authored by Rabbi Yehuda. Akol Cherei L'Mikra Megillah. However, Cherei Shota V'Katan L'Chatchila should not be reading the Megillah on behalf of others. And why is that so? Take the case of a Cheresh. I'm sorry. Why is it so that the Eved they are Yotze? And Chutz Micheres Shot V'Kot means that they should not serve L'Chatchila as the Shliach Tzibur, because this mission is Rabbi Yehuda. And Rabbi Yehuda holds in Kriyat Shema that Lo Hishmi is no Yatza. If that be the case, why does it say in our Mishnah if it's Rabbi Yehuda Chutz Micheres Shot V'Kot? The answer is Chutz Micheres Shot V'Kot, who should not be playing the role of reading the Megillah on behalf of the Tzibur as the Shliach Tzibur, but certainly a Cheresh could be Yotze just the same way that he's Yotze Kriyat Shema, according to Rabbi Yehuda. And a Katan Shegiya L'Chinuch could read on behalf of the Tzibur, and if that be the case, Rabbi Yehuda Machshir B'Katan might mean even L'Chatchila. No, but we're saying the whole mission is Rabbi Yehuda. If the whole mission is Rabbi Yehuda, then Machshir B'Katan means that even that B'di'eved, we could rely on the Kriya of a Katan. So he has a note here. He says it is possible that the Mishnah excludes the deaf person only l'chatchila as the reader of the Megillah. But b'di'eved, his reading is valid, just like Rabbi Yehuda rules with regard to Kriyat Shema. So he has a summary here, in a very short summary. He says the Gemara at this point assumes that our Mishnah, which disqualifies a deaf person from reading the Megillah, means only that preferably he should not read the Megillah, but if he does read, he fulfills the obligation for himself and for his listeners as well. The Gemara assumes that in the case of Shema, Rabbi Yehuda disagrees with Rabbi Yossi, only b'di'eved. However, even Rabbi Yehuda agrees that l'chatchila, we require that you hear the Megillah, and that you should hear the Kriyat Shema. Accordingly, the Gemara concludes that Rabbi Yehuda is the Tan of our Mishnah, since his rulings in the two cases are identical. And now the Gemara is going to question, B'mayu kim to Rabbi Yehuda u'di'eved, that when we say that it's only b'di'eved, that's because even in Kriyat Shema, Rabbi Yehuda would agree that it's only b'di'eved that we accept the Kriya of the Cheresh. Elahadet Tani, Rabbi Yehuda Berei, the Rabbi Shimon ben Pazi, Cheresh Hamedaber ve'eno shomea. Right, he has all the intelligence of a pikeach, but he doesn't hear. Is Torem l'chatchila. Even now, Rabbi Yehuda was the biggest makil in a case of a cheresh we saw in Kriyat Shema, and yet l'chatchila, that's not the way to go. But here we have a case of Torem l'chatchila. Mani, how do we understand this brisa? Rabbi Yehuda di'eved in l'chatchila lo, and Rabbi Yossi afil di'eved nami lo. And now you're telling me that afil l'chatchila Torem, even though he's a cheresh. So Gemara says, Elamai, you want to go back to Rabbi Yehuda and afil l'chatchila is elahad sanya. Lo yivarich adam birkas hamazon belibo. Mani lo Rabbi Yehuda, lo Rabbi Yossi, the Rabbi Yehuda afil l'chatchila. Now you're telling me that according to Rabbi Yehuda, you could be torem even though you're not capable of hearing the bracha, and you should be able to recite Kriyat Shema l'chatchila even though you can't hear it if you're a cheresh. And if that be the case, then why does it say lo yivarech birkas hamazon b'limo, and only b'di'eved he's yotze? But according to Rabbi Yehuda, Belibo should be fine because you don't need to hear it with your ears. And if you're going with Rabbi Yossi, then Rabbi Yossi also afilu b'di'evet nami lo. He cannot fulfill the mitzvah even b'di'evet. So what does it mean? Lo yavarech adam birkas hamazon belibo v'birech yotza. So Gemara here on Daf Chaf Amud Aleph says the following: Li'olam Rabbi Yehuda v'afilu chatchila v'lo kash. You'll ask me the brisa in Birkas Hamazon. Says that what? Lo yivarech adam Birkas Hamazon b'libo v'birech yotza. It's only b'di'eved. It's hadidei v'hadarabeh. The brisa reflects the Shita Rabbi Yehuda himself, his own personal opinion. But the other brisa, which says that if you don't hear the Birkas Hamazon, then that's okay. Even lechatchila, I'm sorry, that only b'di'evet is it okay. That's the Rabbi. That's his teacher. The Sanya Rabbi Yehuda Rabbi Shimon Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah Korei Eshma Sorech Li Sheyishma Liozno Shem Eshma Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad Hashma Lioznecha Mashat Tamotzu B'Pich. So it's Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah who makes this distinction between lechatchila and b'di'eved, but lechatchila tzarich sheyashmi'a li'ozno, and Rabbi Meir Omer asher anoki mitzavcha yom al levavech achas kavonas halev hein advar.